Hey friends, welcome back to the Maranatha Global Bible Study on the Rapture and the endurance of the saints. Now, in this session, we're going to begin a sort of mini-series within the larger series in which we're going to examine and explore what did the early Christians believe with regard to the rapture? Were they pre-trib? Were they post-trib? What did they believe about the rapture? And really, more than even just the earliest Christians, we're going to survey all of church history. We're going to ask the question, when did the pre-tribulational rapture really begin to be taught? So this is going to be a very controversial and important series. And this may be, if I'm to be honest, some of the sessions may be a little boring to some of you, but these are very important. We are creating a resource for those who are curious about this topic. The second housekeeping item concerns my t-shirt. Actually, let me do this. So, my t-shirt, as you can probably see, it says Surströmming, the original Viking sushi, and what I'm doing is just a little shout out to my dear friends in Stockholm, Sweden. So I'm recording this right now, the beginning of April. It will air the beginning of May, but I'm about a month and a half out from a ministry trip that I made to Stockholm, Sweden, and we had a really wonderful time. Like, it was a beautiful time. A lot of internationals as well as locals, Swedes, obviously. We had a great turnout. It was a really beautiful ministry trip. And in the process of that, they fed me surströmming, which is a Swedish delicacy. It basically means sour herring. So this is a good little cultural lesson for you all. So what the Swedes do, and actually the Egyptians do this, it's common to a few different countries, cultures, but they take herring and they salt it heavily, they put it in water, and they ferment it for a year or two. And then they can it, okay? So in the same way that the Germans ferment cabbage, or the Koreans ferment kimchi, bok choy, or whatever it is that they use to make kimchi, you can ferment fish as well, and then they can it. And if you want to know what it tastes like, what it smells like, I'll just say this, and I'm not exaggerating, and I'm not being rude. Like, if you open this stuff inside, you can force an evacuation of a building. Like, it's a stink bomb. Like, it's strong, it's heavy. I was a garbage man for a year after high school, and it reminded me of the smell coming off the back of a garbage truck. But with any delicacy, okay, you think the first time people ate caviar, they were like, oh, this is so delicious right out of the can. No, they ate it and they thought it was disgusting. But then a few days later, their flavor memory kicks in and they go, I want some more of those funky tasting fish eggs or brie or like whatever, any number of delicacies, right? And I'm telling you, the rotten fish that smells horrible, like after you eat it, then a few days later, you're like, man, I want some of that strong flavor profile sour herring. So anyway, it was a cool experience. I survived the challenge 2023, and this is just a shout out to all my friends. They were like, you got to wear the shirt. They got me the shirt and said, you got to wear it for when you're teaching. So I have done so, and blessings to you all, my friends and family in Sweden. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. So what we're going to do in this session is we are going to begin surveying the earliest church writers, often referred to as the early church fathers. I prefer just to say the early church writers. These are the earliest Christian writings that we have. We're going to begin at the very beginning, just after the apostles, and we're going to survey every relevant statement or comment made with regard to the rapture, and we're going to ask, did the early Christians believe in a pre-tribulational or a post-tribulational rapture? Now, the reason this is so important, and I want to just begin by framing this session and the following sessions this way. Okay, within the Christian community, again, those who are pre-tribulational have always said, scholars have always admitted and acknowledged, they've said, look, all of the early church writers were clearly post-trib. They believed that the resurrection and the rapture and the return of Jesus were all part of one singular event, okay? That the resurrection and the rapture happens after the tribulation or at the end of the tribulation when Jesus returns. They were post-tribulational, or you could say pre-wrath, okay? Those who are pre-trib, they've always admitted this until recently, until very recently, because this is one of the most embarrassing realities for pre-tribbers, is they go, Christians have never believed this. This is a new doctrine. This is a novel doctrine. This has never been believed throughout the body of Christ up until the 1830s. Yes, you can find a couple outliers here or there who held to some really weird doctrines, and that shouldn't surprise us. Yes, you can find a few random outliers, but for the most part, the idea of a pre-tribulational rapture was unheard of. It was never believed widely. It was never a common belief. It is a novel, new doctrine. Okay, that's very embarrassing to pre-tribulationists. They go, like, if this is so clear in Scripture, why have Christians never believed it? If this is something the apostles taught, then why did none of the early church writers teach these things? Why do they always believe just the opposite? How could they have gotten off so clearly from the beginning? Okay, so this has always been, as I said, a huge point of contention, of controversy, and embarrassment for the pre-tribulational camp. It just is. Recently, I'm going to say, I can't remember the exact year, it's about 20 years ago, a man named Grant Jeffrey. Okay, Grant Jeffrey was a very well-known name in the prophecy world, kind of a protege of Hal Lindsey from that sort of generation and so forth. And he came forward with what he claimed was a discovery of a very ancient statement made in the writings of a guy named Pseudo-Ephraim. Now, what do you mean Pseudo-Ephraim? Okay, so there's an early church writer named Ephraim the Syrian. He wrote in the 4th century. He's kind of a father among the Aramaic or Syriac churches. And he was so popular, in fact, that later you had individuals that pretended to be Ephraim, and they would write using his wisdom, using his style, even sort of reflecting some of his previous comments, claiming to be Ephraim, but they weren't Ephraim. They were Ephraim pretenders. And there's a handful of them. There's probably quite a few. Anyone who writes while pretending to be Ephraim is referred to in the academic community as Pseudo-Ephraim. But Pseudo-Ephraim, most of his writings, most of the writings that fall under this umbrella, these are like 6th, 7th, 8th century. You're talking even after Islam documents. So you're talking like 300 to 400 years older, or not older, but newer than the original Ephraim. So it's important that we say it's a fake Ephraim, not the real Ephraim, not the 4th century, but rather the 7th century pseudo-Ephraim. And so Grant Jeffrey claims to have found this statement that was pre-trib. And man, this was a big deal. Like, finally we found one statement. One! And this was it, and they held it up. And this has been, again, put on a pedestal and celebrated by those in the pre-tribulational camp for the past 20 years. We will take a whole session to look at this statement, and we will debunk it. It is not a pre-tribulational statement at all. There is not a single, now please hear me, there is not a single pre-tribulational statement among any of the early church writers, not a single one. There is not a single early church writer that held to a pre-tribulational rapture. And this is a simple fact. And let me just say this, I will absolutely debate any leading scholar, teacher, academic, etc., who wants to debate this in public. I will absolutely debate this. Now, since Grant Jeffrey passed away, I'm going to say maybe 10 years ago, since him coming forward with a statement from Pseudo-Ephraim, there have been a handful of others that have tried to bolster the case for pre-tribulationism, and they've made claims that there are all sorts of pre-tribulational statements among the early church writers. So beyond Grant Jeffrey's claim with regard to Pseudo-Ephraim, in more recent years you have a few different individuals, one of which his name is Lee Brainerd. Now let me just say this to be very clear. Lee is a brother. He's a good guy. He's a solid brother with a great heart. I have no question about that. But he is dyed-in-the-wool pre-tribulationist, and he is determined to defend his view. And so what he has done is he went ahead and studied and researched a whole bunch of untranslated or largely untranslated text from Pseudo-Ephraim. Now, Lee will argue and say they're not Pseudo-Ephraim, they're really Ephraim. There's no academic that is going to agree with him on that. There's no actual Ephraim scholar. But he'll make that claim again to try to bolster his case. And he's also looked at a whole bunch of different statements made in the writings of Eusebius. Eusebius was sort of the theological heir to Origen, a very, I'll just say, Gnostic-influenced, Platonic Greek philosophy, pagan Greek philosophy influenced Christian. He was essentially the court theologian for Constantine. And so Lee has gone through a bunch of the writings of Eusebius and claims to have found a bunch of pre-tribulational statements. Not a single one of them are. I'm just going to say that. And we're going to look at some of the primary claims that he makes. But Lee was invited to actually speak at the pre-tribulational research conference, the annual conference, a couple years ago by Dr. Tommy Ice, who heads up the Pre-Trib Research Center. And since his presentation, you've had many other Christians that have been listening to and believing Lee and making the claim. You'll see it in the comments section. They'll say all of the early church writers, they'll say, were pre-tribulational. And you're like, up until 20 years ago, every scholar of the early church fathers, every scholar of the rapture, everyone would say across the boards, unanimous consensus, all of the early church writers were post-trib. And now you have all these claims. Oh, no, they were all pre-trib. And you go, really, where are these They haven't done the research themselves. They've listened to men like Lee Brainerd. Okay, so you have Lee. We're going to examine his claims in some details. We're going to actually take multiple sessions to look at some of his primary claims. Another name, another teacher who has been doing this quite a lot is a guy named Ken Johnson. Some of you may or may not have heard the name. Ken is a brother who has been, over the past 15 years or so, republishing a whole bunch of intertestamental books and documents like Enoch, etc. He just takes documents that are actually pretty readily available. He republishes them, puts them on Amazon. And so he's kind of become known, even in some of the prophecy world circuit, as an expert on the intertestamental literature and this sort of thing. And he's even published a few books where he argues, he actually claims that several of the early church writers, again, the early church fathers, as well as the book of Enoch itself and 2nd Esdras, or 4th Ezra, so some of these intertestamental documents, he actually claims that they teach a pre-tribulational rapture. I'm just going to say, and I'm going to say this gently, it's bizarre. When you look at his logic, when you read his books and try to follow his arguments where he says that these guys are teaching pre-trib, like, it's embarrassingly bizarre, the logic that he uses. Like, there is absolutely no way that Enoch or 4th Ezra, 2nd Esdras was teaching a pre-tribulational rapture. So these are like documents that would come before the New Testament. And so we're going to debunk these claims as well. And then even more recently, there is a minister. His name is Mike Golay. Again, very sweet brother. He is one of the ministers that ministers alongside Amir Tsafati. So we've talked about Amir previously, part of Behold Israel Ministries. And recently Mike did a sermon where he literally claims that all of the early church writers were pre-trib, that it was universal. And he goes through and says, for example, look at Victorinus of Petovim or Petau, or look at Irenaeus. And he goes through and he makes claims and he says they were all pre-trib. Again, embarrassingly bizarre. Like, it's hard for me, I'll just say, as a researcher, someone who is familiar with the writings of the early church fathers, it's very difficult for me to say these guys are being honest. Like, it's hard for me, unless they are simply recycling what they heard, but they clearly have not done their own research. And again, I'm not indicting them. I'm just saying, at the very least, it is incredibly sloppy, incredibly sloppy. The problem is that people listen to authorities and they respect them and they trust them. So people are big followers of Behold Israel Ministries or Amir, and so they listen to Mike and they go, no, Mike Golay did a presentation. He says all of the early church fathers were preachers, and they believe it. And there is nothing that could be further from the truth. Okay, and then probably the best effort to do this is in a book called Dispensationalism Before Darby by William C. Watson. Watson also just passed away several years ago. But this is the best effort at what I will say an academic effort to try to claim that dispensationalism was not only that not only that it existed, but that it was fairly broadly believed before John Nelson Darby. Okay, so this is an academic effort to try to do away with the embarrassment of Darbyism, quite frankly. I'm just going to say this. We're going to take a whole session to deal with Watson's book. We'll probably do it at the end as we wrap this mini-series within the series up. It fails. I'm just going to say this to be clear, because this is what people are pointing to. Again, this is what people do, is they rely on authorities. They go, some authority said so. Some authority wrote a book. I'm sure it's true. This book is filled with brazen, embarrassing errors, mistakes, even typos, but typos are typos, historical, factual, categorical errors. It is bad. It fails miserably in its goal, which is to prove dispensationalism or Darbyism before Darby. It fails miserably. But what's the problem with this is that you actually have other very legitimate, careful, responsible, good scholars who are pointing to this book and saying, this guy does a good job of making his case. And thus it filters down, again, to the lay people, to the average Christian who goes, yeah, I've heard that dispensationalism is much older than the critics claim. Nothing could be further from the truth. So we will take some time to deal with that. Okay, so we have framed what we're going to be discussing, and now we're going to begin at the beginning. We're going to go all the way back to the early days, just after the apostles, in the first century. And we're going to begin exploring from the earliest documents that we have, as I said, looking at statements written by those that lived in the post-apostolic era, and how did they believe? What did they believe with regard to the rapture and the timing of the rapture? Did they believe in a post-tribulational or a pre-tribulational rapture? There's no better way than for us to actually look at the statements themselves. And so, as I said, I want to just make this statement very clear. At the front end, there is not a single statement anywhere in the first 1,000+ years, the first 1,400 years of the church, you will not find a single statement that is pre-tribulational in nature, period. Not one, not a single statement. Every single statement made by the early church writers for the first 1,000+ years of the church is clearly post-tribulational. They expected, they believed that the church would face the Antichrist. They expected and believed that they themselves, if they lived to the tribulation, would face the Antichrist, that their immediate audience, their listeners, the ones that were reading their writings, that they would face the Antichrist, that the church would face the Antichrist, and that they would be resurrected or raptured when Jesus returns at the end of the tribulation. So I'm going to start out here with just a chart so you can see the time frame that we're looking at. This chart here details the first 4 centuries of the church. Of course, Jesus died and was tortured, crucified, and resurrected in the 1st century. And so we're going to start out in the latter part of the 1st century and go into the early part of the 2nd century, looking at 4 documents, starting out with 4 documents. The Didache, it's pronounced differently by different people, the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, and then the writings of Justin Martyr. Okay, so let's begin with the Didache, and we're going to come back to this later because, as I said, Mike Golay, and there are others, actually claim that the Didache teaches a pre-tribulational rapture. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. So in the 16th paragraph of the document, now let me just say this, some people actually ascribe apostolic authorship to the Didache. I personally question that, but I am not a scholar of the early church writers. I'm not a patristic scholar. But there is good evidence that this is a very early document. Some place it as late as the 3rd century, but I'm just going to start here with, again, academic consensus, which holds that it's actually a late 1st century document. Okay, so again, the 16th paragraph, verses 4 through 8. Speaking of the last days, it says, "Then shall appear the deceiver of the world. Then shall appear the deceiver of the world. And he shall commit iniquities which have never been since the world began." So here he's quoting, the Didache is quoting Matthew 24, in which Jesus says the same thing, as well as Daniel chapter 12, in which Gabriel says the same thing. There's going to be a time of tribulation such as has never been since there was a nation until that time. Then shall the creation of mankind come to the fiery trial. Who is going to come to the fiery trial? All of creation, the creation of mankind. It doesn't say then a particular group of people, then Israel will come to the tribulation, but we will be raptured out of there beforehand. It doesn't say anything about any rapture. It just says all of creation, the creation of mankind, will come to the fiery trial, and then many will be offended and lost. Okay, so it says that many who go into the tribulation will fall away. Many who face this trial will fall away. It doesn't say the church will be raptured first, and then a whole multitude of people will get saved, but then after they get saved, many of them will fall away. This would be the traditional pre-trib template. They would say, we're going to be raptured out of here. Then you have all these tribulation saints that get saved, but then after getting saved, many of them fall away. It doesn't say anything like that. It says the creation of mankind will face this trial, and many will fall away. The writer of the Didache obviously expected the immediate audience of the Didache to face the Antichrist if they lived to see that particular time. But those who endure, they who endure in their faith shall be saved. Again, there's no qualifier. There's nothing here. There's no vague hint of a pre-tribulational rapture. And then it says, then shall the world see the Lord coming on the clouds of heaven. And I don't actually have it quoted here, but it is important that the first statement here in paragraph 16, it says, then shall the church face this great trial, so to speak. And it says, then the whole time of your faith will be nothing if you don't endure patiently. And this is one of the main statements. We're actually going to come back to this. Throughout the writings of the early church fathers, you see this belief that the time of testing, the great tribulation, that this is the final trial, that all Christians, we can run strong right up until the end and then fail the final test. And your whole time of your faith will be worth nothing if you don't endure during that time. There's no reference, there's no hint of a pre-tribulational rapture here. Rather, the writer of the Didache expected a multitude, all of creation of mankind, to face the Antichrist, to face the tribulation, and many would fall away. Many would fall away during that time. But those who endure in their faith will be saved. The Epistle of Barnabas, again, late 1st, early 2nd century, he says this. He says, the final stumbling block approaches. The final stumbling block, that the black one, he calls the Antichrist the black one, may find no means of entrance. In order that the Antichrist will find no means of entrance, let us flee from every vanity. Let who? Who should flee? Us. The writer of the Epistle of Barnabas, assuming it was a Barnabas, he said, let us flee from every vanity, so that when the Antichrist comes, he won't find anything in us. He won't find any means of entrance. The writer of the Epistle of Barnabas expected his audience and himself, if they live to see the Antichrist, to face the trial of the Antichrist. He doesn't say the tribulation saints or those other people who get raptured, who get saved after we get raptured. No, he says, let us flee from every vanity, so that when the Antichrist comes, he doesn't find any entrance into us. He expected to face the tribulation. Absolutely, unarguably clear. He goes on, he says, let us utterly hate the works of the way of wickedness. Take heed lest resting at our ease. He's warning his listeners. Take heed lest if you become lazy, as those of us who are called of God, we should fall asleep in our sins, and the wicked prince, acquiring power over us, should thrust us away from the kingdom of the Lord. The whole statement is a warning to his readers to be ready, to be prepared, to be awake, to be alert, to flee from sin, to flee from vanity, so that the Antichrist wouldn't find anything in them. The writer of the Epistle of Barnabas is clearly post-tribulational. He expected to face the tribulation and the Antichrist. The shepherd of Hermas, again, amazing to me, absolutely mind-boggling, that Brother Mike Goulet claims that the shepherd of Hermas teaches a pre-tribulational rapture. Nothing could be further from the truth. In chapter 2, verse 2, He says, blessed are you, blessed are those who endure the great tribulation. Who? Blessed are you. The writer of The Shepherd of Hermas, he's kind of mysterious, we don't really know who wrote it. He writes to his audience and he says, blessed are you who endure the great tribulation. Those who are listening, those who were his readers, his audience, he expected them to face the great tribulation. He talks to his audience and he says, you, blessed are you who endure the great tribulation. Crystal clear. He was post-tribulational. He says, and they shall not deny their own life. And then later in chapter 4, you have this really weird vision where the shepherd, he sees this big monster and he's afraid the monster is going to devour him, but then he walks by it and he realizes the Lord protects him and the monster represents the tribulation and this type of thing. And after the whole vision, again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, he says this, chapter 4, verse 3. He says, those therefore, which he already said were his readers, those who continue steadfast and are put through the fire will be purified by means of it. So again, for his readers, he goes, if you're put through the trial, if you're put through the fire, you'll be purified. He expected his readers to face the tribulation. 3 of the earliest documents that we have, we're talking late 1st century, from the same century that Jesus and the apostles ministered during. They were post-tribulational. They knew nothing of any pre-tribulational rapture. There's no hint of it anywhere. Then we have the writings of Justin Martyr in his dialogue with Trypho the Jew. And again, he's late 1st, early 2nd century, and he says this. He says, 2 advents of Christ have been announced. There's going to be 2 advents of Christ. The one in which he is set forth as suffering, inglorious, dishonored, and crucified, but the other in which he shall come from heaven with glory. How many second comings are there? There's one more. There's only one second coming. He came the first time, he's coming the second time. He's only coming one more time. The pre-tribulational teaching of the rapture holds that Jesus is coming once invisibly to rapture for his church, then he's coming back again a 3rd time with his church. That there are 2 more comings. One is invisible, one is a phantom rapture catching up, where he just comes down to the clouds, meets us in the clouds, but he does descend from heaven, comes from heaven, and then he goes back up. And then 7 years later, he comes back with his church. The pre-tribulational rapture camp teaches that there are 2 more advents, 2 more comings. Now, they'll try to say, no, we don't. We only believe there's one coming. You go, well, does he come the first time from heaven? Well, yeah, but we don't call it a coming. Like, semantics bouncing all over the place. One guy says one thing, one guy says another thing. They contradict themselves and each other. There's only one more coming. And Justin Martyr expected one more coming when he would come from heaven in glory. What does glory mean? Shining, radiating like the sun, like the sunlight, visible, all right? Every eye, all flesh shall see him, as Isaiah says. And then he says, when the man of apostasy who speaks strange things against the Most High shall venture to do unlawful deeds on the earth against us, the Christians. Justin Martyr said the Antichrist is going to plan to do things against himself and his audience, us. Not the tribulation saints, not an other group, but rather the church. He says us, the Christians. He included himself and his fellow Christians that were alive on the earth at the time. The Antichrist will come visibly from heaven to save the Christians that are enduring the tribulation of the Antichrist. Now we're going to move forward in time a little bit. We're going to begin in the early to the middle of the 2nd century. So now we're talking the 100s, right? Because the 1st century is not even in the hundreds yet. And then moving forward into the early part of the 3rd century, we're going to look at the writings of Irenaeus, Hippolytus, and Tertullian. Okay, so 3 writers from 2nd, early 3rd century. Irenaeus says this in his Against Heresies, chapter 5. He says, and then the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings. These are the 10 kings of the Antichrist. He says, they have received no kingdom as yet, but they shall receive power as if kings with 1 hour. with the beast. He's actually quoting Revelation. And then he says, and they, again, the empire of the Antichrist, the kings that will be under the authority of the Antichrist, it says, they shall lay waste Babylon and burn her with fire, and shall give their kingdom to the beast and put the church to flight. Here is very specific language, using dispensational terms, the very foundation, please hear me, the very foundation for dispensational pre-tribulationism is a rigid, harsh, clear, clean distinction, separation between Israel and the church. And they would say that Jacob's trouble, or the time of the Great Tribulation, is Jacob's trouble. It's for Israel. It's not for the church. The church will not ever see the Antichrist. Only Israel will see the Antichrist. It's only for Israel. And I go, and the tribulation saints? And they go, yeah, but they just happen to be there because they get saved. Are they part of the church? No, they're not part of the church. Are they part of the body of Christ? No. Are they born again? Well, yeah, they have to be born again because you can't be saved if you're not born again. So they're born again of the Spirit, and there's only one baptism, one body. It says literally one body. So who are they? Oh, they're a different group. You go, that's unbiblical. No, because that's what dispensationalism teaches. It's just crazy, the sort of presumptive circular logic of it all. But here you have Irenaeus clearly saying that the church, his expectation was that the church will face the Antichrist. Just like Barnabas, just like the shepherd of Hermas, just like the Didache, all expected the writers themselves and their listeners to face the tribulation and the Antichrist. Clearly, Irenaeus says the church will face the Antichrist. The idea that anyone would seriously claim that Irenaeus was pre-tribulational is absurd. It's bizarre. And yet, Lee Brainerd, Mike Golay, and now a whole host of other people who are trusting and listening to them are making the same claims. There is no scholar in the world. Tommy Ice would deny such. Dr. David Reagan denies such. I can pull up quotes from them. They're like, no, Irenaeus, all things considered, was post-tribulational. These guys, at least, they're academic enough to be honest with the data, even though they're pre-tribulationists. I really, as I've said previously, I really love and appreciate Dr. David Reagan. So here's another statement from Irenaeus. He says, it is therefore more certain and less hazardous to await the fulfillment of the prophecy. What's he talking about? He's talking about the number of 666. This is actually really fascinating, that in the 1st and 2nd century, well, 2nd century, you had Irenaeus, it could be as late as the early 3rd century, warning Christians to be careful about trying to calculate the name and the number of the beast. He goes, it's more certain and less dangerous, less hazardous to await the fulfillment of the prophecy rather than making surmises and casting about for any names that may present themselves. Inasmuch as many names can be found possessing the number mentioned, 666, and the same question will, after all, remain unsolved. So here's the thing. As far back as the 2nd and 3rd century, you had Christians that were trying to calculate which people's names, which world leaders could be calculated through using the gematria, which is where you assign a number to each letter and whose name added up to 666. They were already trying to do that. Guys, this has been a weird fixation, a weird fascination, a weird pastime of Christians for the past 2,000 years. Even just recently, there's a real popular kind of thing going around in the prophecy sphere where people have watched videos from this guy who claims that King Charles is the Antichrist. He's been making these claims for years. If you read his original book, the basis for his whole going down this sort of rabbit hole was that he had this software program where you run various names through it and it tells you which ones might or might not come out to the number 666. And he claims that Prince Charles comes out to number 666. Now, and people are going crazy about it. And they're like, oh, and look at his coat of arms and all these symbols and different things, and ignoring very clear scriptural criteria. And this is, I see this so commonly, ignore very clear scriptural criteria and then go, yeah, but, you know, like when he was in the Navy, his nickname was the Dragon. You go, oh, that means he's the Antichrist. No. That's like, you can find all kinds of weird things to frame anyone as demonic. but do they align with the biblical criteria? That's all that matters. But the fact that it started out with a computer program that said this guy's name is 666, to me, it almost makes me chuckle, because I'm like, that's exactly what you don't do. That's exactly how you don't begin trying to understand these things. You begin with what the scriptures clearly say and say, does this individual align with what the scriptures clearly say? You let the scriptures confirm something. You don't try to find reasons to make someone the Antichrist. Antichrist pointing is one of the most long-lasting, weird, running, as I said, pastimes of the church, and it's embarrassing. Let me just put it this way, guys. So, Ronald, Wilson, Reagan, Gore, like there's so many names, William Jefferson Clinton, that come out to 666. But here's the thing. Okay, so we're dealing with a couple things. Let me just touch on this. We're dealing with the issue of gematria. As I said, gematria is where you assign a number to each letter, you lay it out, you sort of have your key, you look at someone's name, and then you add up all of the total numbers, and you go, oh, look, it adds up to whatever it might be. Here's the difficulty, is gematria, it seems to be referenced in the book of Revelation. The problem is you go, okay, so in calculating someone's name, let's say it's William Jefferson Clinton, or maybe Hillary Jefferson Clinton, I don't know. Let's say that you're trying to calculate their name. Do you go with President William Jefferson Clinton? Like, do you use like terms and titles? If they're a junior, do you include the junior? Do you include their middle name or just their first and last name? So with each name, there's probably, I'm going to say, about 5 or 6 different variations that you can use of their name. Everybody has a, it could be William J. Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton. Like, which way do you go? So then there's the whole debate just in terms of which letters and so forth to use, and you have quite a variety there. Then secondly, there's the question is you go, so do you do it in English because he is an American president, or do you do it in Greek because the book of Revelation says to calculate it and it was written in Greek? So do you do the gematria do you convert William Jefferson Clinton over to Greek letters and then assign numbers to them and then add it all up? And when you do that, do you do President William Jefferson Clinton or do you do William J. Clinton? So now you have the possibility of doing it in both English or Greek, or do you go back to Hebrew? But the book of Revelation is written in Greek. Would they have done it in Hebrew? So you have multiple different options. Here's the point. Multiple different options. And even then different numbers that you can assign. Is A 1 or is A 6? So you have a few different, and there's no universal agreement on it. There's no universal rule. Okay, so you have multiple possibilities, and you can, if you're really determined, make a lot of people's names come out to 666. That should not be the big, wow, this guy must be the Antichrist. That should be like the last thing at the end after they have confirmed all of the other biblical criteria. Then you go, and his name does happen to very easily, through gematria, line up with 666. And this is exactly what Irenaeus is saying. He's going, we need to be careful. We should wait until afterwards. We shouldn't be trying to find different people's names. And he makes all of these points. And it's amazing that this was a pastoral discussion in the prophecy community all the way back in the 2nd century. And yet we're still doing the same stupid things. Forgive me, but we're still doing it. And so this is powerful. Okay, now let's get back to his statement. He's warning his readers. He says, let us be careful. Let us be careful in terms of trying to calculate the number of the beast. Now watch this, and this is so critical. He says, inasmuch as many names can be found possessing the number mentioned, and the same question will, after all, remain. Like, even if someone's name adds up to 666, it's still unsolved. Okay, and then he says this, but he's talking about the Apostle John, he indicates the number of his name now. So he tells us the number of his name beforehand, so that when this man comes, we may avoid him. Irenaeus says we, who? Himself and his listeners, his audience. He goes, the Apostle John told us the name of the Antichrist so that when the time comes, we, the Christians who are alive on the earth at the time, Irenaeus and his listeners, could avoid the Antichrist. Irenaeus expected the church, himself, his audience, to face the Antichrist if they lived to the time of the Antichrist. He says they will be aware of who he is. he says, Irenaeus says, for all these and other words were unquestionably spoken in reference to what? The resurrection of the just. So the New Testament refers to the resurrection of the just. Jesus refers to it. Irenaeus here talks about it. He doesn't talk about the resurrections, plural, of the just, which is what pre-tribulationism teaches. It teaches that there are multiple resurrections still in our future. They're all part of the first resurrection, but they have part A and part B. That the first one will be the rapture of the Christians before the tribulation, and then there'll be another resurrection of the just after the tribulation of the saints of Israel, but only those in Christ will be raised up beforehand. They have literally multiple resurrections of the just. The scriptures teach one resurrection of the just, and that's all Irenaeus speaks of. One singular resurrection of the righteous. These are the faithful saints of old from the Old Testament times, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, etc., as well as all of the saints after Jesus who are in Christ all together. And this is exactly what Jesus said, didn't he? He said that in that day, many will come from the east and the west and recline with who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the table. So Gentiles from all over the earth, from the east and the west, in that day will all recline at the wedding banquet together with the faithfuls of old. So it's the resurrection of the just, not just the resurrection of Christians, right? And then Revelation, by the way, talks about the first resurrection happening when? After the tribulation, after the destruction of Babylon, at the end. Look at Revelation 20. The first resurrection doesn't happen 7 years before the return of Jesus. It happens at the end of the tribulation, and it only speaks of one first resurrection, one resurrection of the just. So he says, the resurrection of the just, which takes place after the coming of the Antichrist. When did Irenaeus believe the singular resurrection of the just would take place? After the coming of the Antichrist and the destruction of all the nations, after the nations under his authority are judged. That's when Jesus returns. The resurrection of the just happens when Jesus returns. That's what Irenaeus believed. Okay, now we have one statement, and this is the statement that the pre-tribbers, or some of them, as I said, Mike Golay and Lee Brainerd, will point to and say Irenaeus was clearly taught a pre-tribulational rapture. They will ignore these other statements that I just quoted. They will absolutely ignore them. They won't quote them. They won't let you know they exist. They'll just quote this one statement. Now, this is incredibly irresponsible. If you want to know what the Bible teaches on any issue, do you just find one verse that supports your view? Or do you look at all the verses that speak to this particular topic? You look at all of them. If you want to know what any individual believes about some subject, you look at all of the statements they've made. Irenaeus says crystal clear that he expects the church to face the Antichrist. He expects to be able to identify the Antichrist when he comes. And his listeners as well. He was clearly post-trib. He puts the resurrection of the just after the return of Jesus at the end of the tribulation. And here he says this, therefore, when in the end the church shall suddenly be caught up from all this, it is said. So it's just a general statement that during that time, it says, there shall be tribulation such as has not been since the beginning, neither shall be. Now, if you just read that statement alone and you really want to find and see a pre-tribulational rapture, I get it. They go, this seems to be something a pre-tribber would say. I go, yeah, that kind of, it's worded weird. Admittedly, it's strange. But you don't find a weird, awkward, vague statement to try to prove your case and ignore the other statements which are crystal clear. That is incredibly irresponsible. It's incredibly dishonest, quite frankly. And then watch this. If you simply read the next line, it shows that he clearly was not speaking from a pre-tribulational perspective. He says, for this, talking about the tribulation, is what? The last contest of the righteous, in which when they overcome, they are crowned with incorruption. Here he speaks of the last contest of the righteous. Like, the assumption is that himself and his audience would face this last test, this final contest. That's how it's always believed throughout the writings of the early church. This is the great final test. the final trial when our faith will be proven. But there's absolutely no way that anyone can honestly and fairly claim that Irenaeus taught a pre-tribulational rapture. Like, it's genuinely absurd. And as I said, I will debate anyone publicly, any authority, any very well-known teacher who would like to discuss the belief concerning the rapture throughout church history. I'm happy to debate this topic because there has been brazen dishonesty that has been perpetrated onto the body of Christ concerning this issue. Hippolytus. Hippolytus was a theologian from Rome, one of the most important theologians of the 3rd century, if not the most important theologian of the 3rd century. He says, "For when the times advance, he too," speaking of the Antichrist, "of whom these things are said, will be manifested." So here's the Antichrist. It says, "Now concerning the tribulation of the persecution which is to fall upon the church from the adversary." Could not be any more clear. Hippolytus, like Irenaeus, like all of those before him, expected the church to face the Antichrist. He says that refers to the 1,203 days with which the tyrant, again, that's the last 3.5 years, is to reign and persecute the church. Unarguable, no question. There is no debate. Hippolytus was a post-tribulationist. He expected the church to face the Antichrist. Commenting on the book of Daniel, he says, "When the times are fulfilled and the 10 horns spring from the beast in the last times, then the Antichrist will appear among them when he makes war against the saints and persecutes them." Here it is, that we may expect the manifestation of the Lord from heaven. Jesus will return from heaven in the midst of the Antichrist persecuting the saints. What does he mean by the saints? The church. What does the book of Revelation mean by the saints? The church. The saints who will be alive on the earth during the tribulation are the church. There's no such thing as the church and Israel and the tribulation saints. There is one body, one baptism, one Lord over all. Tertullian, we're going to wrap this up here and we'll continue our survey next week. Tertullian says this in his sermon on the resurrection of the flesh. He says, "The Antichrist with his false prophet may wage war on the church of God, and that after the casting of the devil into the bottomless pit for a while." Okay, so again, the church of God. The Antichrist will persecute the church of God. Tertullian, Hippolytus, Irenaeus, Barnabas, the Didachy, and the shepherd of Hermas, 6 of the earliest documents that we have from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, unanimously, unarguably, all taught and believed a post-tribulational rapture, resurrection at the end of the tribulation. There is not a hint of pre-tribulationism anywhere for the first 300 years after Jesus. Okay, so in next week's session, we're going to continue this survey right up until about the 8th century. This might be a little bit boring for some of you, but again, we're putting forward these resources for those. This is a very important discussion, particularly in light of the fact that lies are being spoken and taught now. In order to defend a lie, they begin by twisting the scriptures, the New Testament. Now they're actually trying to twist the words of individuals, of the early church writers, and literally lie to the body of Christ. And you might go, "Joel, why fight about this?" Because the truth matters. And this issue is very pastorally relevant. So we're going to continue the survey next week. Look forward to seeing you guys all next week. Until then, have a blessed week, friends. Embrace the cross. Endure patiently. Be blessed. Maranatha.